The American pilot watched in disbelief through his gun sight. The Japanese bomber ahead was engulfed in intense flames, yet it continued flying in perfect formation. How is this possible, he thought, as he watched the enemy crew continue their mission even with their aircraft transformed into a flying torch. Months later, when U.S. Navy engineers finally examined a captured Betty, the answer horrified them. What they discovered would reveal one of the darkest secrets of World War II aircraft design, and explain why Japanese pilots preferred crashing their planes into American ships rather than continuing to fly these death traps. If you want to discover the deadly secret behind the Betty bomber and understand how this engineering decision changed the course of the Pacific War, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Don't forget to leave your like to support our work bringing fascinating World War II stories. In the comments, tell me, had you heard about the Betty bomber before? Chapter 1, The Fatal Encounter. Guadalcanal Island, August 1942. Captain Marion Carl adjusted his flight goggles as he scanned the blue Pacific horizon. A veteran with dozens of missions, he thought he'd seen everything in aerial warfare. He was about to discover he was wrong. Bandits at 2 o'clock. The crackling voice over the radio broke the silence. Carl turned his head and saw them, a formation of 9 Mitsubishi G4M Japanese bombers, known to Americans as Betty, flying in perfect V formation at about 13,000 feet. They were big, tempting targets. Carl dove his F-4F Wildcat toward the bombers, with his squadron following in tight formation. Combat experience had taught American pilots it was better to attack from the rear, where the Betty had less defensive firepower. He aligned his sights with the rightmost bomber and pressed the trigger. The .50 caliber machine guns roared, tracing a line of impacts along the Betty's fuselage. Carl expected to see debris, maybe a wing separating. What he saw left him perplexed. Within seconds, bright orange flames engulfed the entire Japanese aircraft. It wasn't a normal fire, it was like someone had lit a match in a gasoline tank. It'll drop now, Carl thought, preparing to search for the next target. But the Betty kept flying. Flames lit the aluminum fuselage, consuming the plane from inside out, but the engines kept running and the bomber maintained its position in formation. It was unnatural, even frightening. Through the flames, Carl could see figures moving in the cockpit. The Japanese crew was alive, working at their stations while being literally cooked alive. The bomber continued for another 20, maybe 30 seconds, before finally beginning to lose altitude. Even then, it didn't explode. It simply descended like a controlled fireball until it plunged into the ocean. Carl attacked another Betty. Same thing. A few shots, instant flames, but the aircraft kept flying long enough to be terrifying. It was like fighting flaming ghosts. By the end of the combat, 4 Bettys had been shot down, all following the same macabre pattern. First they burned, then they fell. Back at base, Carl and his squadron mates gathered for debriefing. The intelligence officer listened intently as pilot after pilot described the same thing. Japanese bombers caught fire with incredible ease, but rarely exploded in midair like American or German aircraft did. It's like they're made of paper and gasoline, commented a young lieutenant. I saw the crew moving inside, even with everything on fire. How do they stand it? No one had an answer. Navy intelligence had already heard similar reports from other theaters of operation. Pilots across the Pacific Fleet were reporting the same bizarre phenomenon. The Japanese had fast, long-range bombers, but they transformed into flying torches at the slightest hit. What the Americans didn't know yet was that they were witnessing the result of one of the war's most controversial engineering decisions. Japanese designers had made deliberate choices in the G4M's design that made it extremely vulnerable to fire. And when American engineers finally got their hands on an intact Betty, they would discover something that would leave them simultaneously amazed at Japanese audacity and horrified at the consequences. The mystery of the Betty bomber was only beginning to reveal itself. In the following months, each encounter with these aircraft would reinforce the same terrible truth. Japanese pilots were flying in fire traps, and most of them knew it. The question haunting the Americans was, why? Why would a nation known for its precision engineering create something so manifestly dangerous to its own crews? The answer was locked inside the aluminum structure of every Betty that flew. And soon, very soon, the Americans would have the chance to discover exactly what made these bombers so deadly, not just to their enemies, but especially to those who piloted them. The captured Betty that would change everything was already making its way into American hands. When engineers opened its panels and examined its fuel system, they would understand the horrifying truth. The Japanese hadn't just accepted a design flaw, they had deliberately chosen vulnerability in pursuit of performance. And that choice had sentenced thousands of their own men to death by fire. Chapter 2: The Birth of a Dangerous Legend. Japan, 1937. At Mitsubishi Heavy Industries facilities in Nagoya, a team of engineers faced a seemingly impossible problem. The Imperial Japanese Navy had made an audacious request: create a medium attack bomber capable of flying 3,700 miles without refueling, carrying a full bomb load, and maintaining speeds over 230 miles per hour. For context, that was roughly the distance from Tokyo to Wake Island and back. Chief Engineer Kiro Hanjo stared at the specifications on his desk. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion: it was impossible. Or rather, it was impossible if you wanted the crew to survive being hit. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. To achieve the range demanded by the Navy, they would need massive fuel tanks. To achieve the speed, they needed powerful engines but lightweight. To achieve both, something had to be sacrificed. The debate within the engineering team was intense. Some argued for armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, technologies the Americans and British were already implementing. But armor meant weight. Self-sealing tanks meant reduced fuel capacity. The numbers simply didn't work. To meet the Navy's specifications, they would have to make a devil's bargain. "The mission comes first," declared Captain Fujita, the Navy liaison officer. "Our pilots are willing to die for the Emperor. They need an aircraft that can reach the enemy, not one that protects them from cowardice." It was the prevailing philosophy in Japanese military doctrine: offense over defense, mission accomplishment over survival. And so the decision was made. The Mitsubishi G4M would have thin aluminum skin, just enough to maintain structural integrity. No armor plating protecting the crew. No self-sealing fuel tanks. Instead, the fuel would be stored in large, unprotected tanks integrated into the wing structure. More than 1,000 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel would sit in thin metal containers with nothing between them and enemy bullets. The first prototype flew in October 1939, and it was magnificent. With a range of 3,700 miles and a top speed of 265 miles per hour, it exceeded expectations. The Navy was thrilled. Here was their long-range strike weapon, capable of projecting power across the vast Pacific. They immediately ordered it into production. But test pilots quickly noticed something disturbing. During training exercises with live ammunition, even minor damage to the wings resulted in catastrophic fires. The fuel tanks, directly exposed to any projectile that penetrated the thin skin, would rupture and ignite almost instantly. The high-octane fuel, combined with the pure oxygen environment at high altitudes, created an explosive mixture that turned the entire wing into an incendiary bomb. Lieutenant Suzuki, one of the test pilots, filed a report: "The aircraft is exceptionally vulnerable to fire. A single tracer round to the wing can result in complete loss of the aircraft within 30 seconds. Recommend immediate implementation of protective measures." His report was filed and ignored. Production was already ramping up. The Navy needed these bombers, and they needed them now. By December 1941, when Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor, over 150 G4M Betty bombers were in service. In the opening months of the war, they performed brilliantly. Flying from bases in Formosa and Indochina, they struck Allied positions across Southeast Asia. On December 10, 1941, a formation of Bettys participated in sinking the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse, the first time aircraft alone had sunk capital ships at sea. The Japanese press hailed the Betty as a wonder weapon. Propaganda newsreels showed the elegant bombers flying in perfect formation, releasing their deadly payloads. What the newsreels didn't show were the losses. Of the 27 Bettys that participated in the attack on the British ships, 3 were shot down, all by catching fire from anti-aircraft hits. Crews began calling it hamaki, the cigar, because of how it looked when burning. Others called it the one-shot lighter because a single bullet could ignite it. These weren't jokes told in safety, they were gallows humor whispered among men who knew they were being sent to die in flying coffins. Yet the pilots flew anyway. Japanese military culture demanded absolute obedience and self-sacrifice. To question the aircraft's design was to question the Navy itself, to show weakness, to dishonor oneself and one's family. So they climbed into their Bettys, knowing that any combat mission might be their last, that a single lucky shot from an enemy fighter could transform their aircraft into a funeral pyre at 15,000 feet. By mid-1942, as American forces began to push back and fighter opposition increased, Betty loss rates skyrocketed. It wasn't unusual for bomber formations to lose 30 to 40% of their aircraft in a single mission. Entire crews were being incinerated in minutes of combat. And still, the bombers kept flying, their thin aluminum skin offering no more protection than tissue paper against the hammering .50 caliber rounds of American fighters. The engineers at Mitsubishi knew they had created a death trap, but changing the design now would mean halting production, retooling factories, and admitting their fatal miscalculation. The war machine had momentum, and it could not, stop. The Betty would continue to fly, continue to burn, and continue to kill its own crews far more efficiently than it killed the enemy. Chapter 3, The Capture. June 1943, Aleutian Islands. The weather was miserable, as it always was in this godforsaken corner of the Pacific. Dense fog rolled across Ack Island as a U.S. Navy patrol spotted something unusual, a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber sitting in a shallow bay, largely intact, abandoned by its crew. Commander James Russell received the report with barely contained excitement. After nearly 2 years of war, the Navy had shot down hundreds of Bettys, but always over water or in circumstances that left nothing but wreckage. Here, finally, was an opportunity to examine one of these mysterious bombers up close. "I want that aircraft recovered, intact if possible," Russell ordered. "Get a salvage team out there immediately. I don't care about the weather. This is priority 1. The salvage operation took 3 days. Working in freezing water and persistent rain, Navy divers and technicians carefully extracted the Betty from the bay. The aircraft had suffered damage during its crash landing, the left engine was destroyed, and the nose was crumpled, but the critical systems were intact. Most importantly, the wing structure and fuel systems were accessible. When the Betty was finally transported to a secure facility in Dutch Harbor, a team of naval aviation engineers descended on it like archaeologists discovering a pharaoh's tomb. Leading the examination was Lieutenant Commander Donald McPherson, a brilliant aeronautical engineer who had designed fuel systems for several American aircraft. McPherson began his examination with the exterior. The Betty was indeed beautiful, sleek lines, excellent aerodynamics, clearly designed for speed and range. The twin Mitsubishi Kase engines were powerful and well engineered. The fuselage was spacious, with good visibility for the crew. On paper, it was an impressive aircraft. Then he examined the skin thickness. His calipers showed measurements that made him check his instruments twice. The aluminum skin averaged just 0.031 inches thick, about the thickness of 2 sheets of cardboard. American bombers like the B-17 had skin twice as thick in critical areas, plus armor plating protecting crew and vital systems. "There's no armor," noted Lieutenant Chen, running his hands along the fuselage interior. "None at all. The pilot has less protection than a guy driving a Jeep." But the real revelation came when McPherson's team began examining the fuel system. What they discovered left them stunned into silence. One engineer actually dropped his flashlight in shock. The Betty's fuel tanks were integrated directly into the wing structure, a common enough design principle. But in American aircraft, these tanks were protected by self-sealing technology, multiple layers of rubber that would swell and seal punctures when fuel leaked through. The Betty had no such protection. The fuel tanks were simply bare metal chambers welded into the wing. Worse, the fuel lines ran exposed through the fuselage and wings with minimal shielding. In American bombers, critical fuel lines were armored or routed through protected channels. The Betty's fuel lines were as vulnerable as garden hoses. McPherson did the calculations. A Betty carried approximately 1,140 gallons of fuel, significantly more than comparable American bombers. This fuel was distributed across multiple tanks that collectively occupied nearly 40% of the wing's internal volume. And all of it was completely unprotected. "Jesus Christ," McPherson whispered. "It's a flying gas tank." He called his team together and drew diagrams on a chalkboard, explaining what they'd found. "Gentlemen, here's what happens when you shoot this aircraft. Any projectile, and I mean any projectile, even a pistol round, that penetrates the wing skin will almost certainly rupture a fuel tank or fuel line. The high-octane aviation fuel immediately vaporizes in the low-pressure, oxygen-rich environment at altitude." He drew another diagram. "Now, most likely, there are hot engine components nearby, or the tracer round itself provides ignition. The vapor ignites instantly. Because the tanks aren't sealed, fire spreads rapidly through the fuel system. Within seconds, you have flames throughout the entire wing structure." "But why doesn't it explode immediately?" asked Lieutenant Morrison. "When our planes get hit in the tanks, they usually explode pretty fast." McPherson nodded. "That's actually the most diabolical part. It doesn't explode immediately because the fuel burns rather than detonates. The wing structure has enough ventilation that pressure doesn't build up catastrophically. Instead, the aircraft becomes a flying torch. The crew has maybe 30 seconds to a minute of consciousness before heat and smoke overcome them. The engines often keep running because they're somewhat isolated from the fire. So you get this nightmare scenario, a plane that burns but keeps flying, with the crew dying slowly inside." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Every man there had heard the stories from fighter pilots, the Betty bombers that burned and burned but wouldn't fall. Now they understood why. "Why?" Lieutenant Chin finally asked. "Why would they design it this way? The Japanese aren't stupid. They had to know this would happen." McPherson pulled out the performance specifications they'd calculated from examining the aircraft. "Range. That's why. This bomber can fly 3,700 miles. Do you know what our B-25 Mitchell's range is? About 1,350 miles. The Betty has nearly 3 times the range. To achieve that, they needed massive fuel capacity and light weight. Self-sealing tanks would add 1,000 pounds. Armor plating another 800 pounds. That weight comes directly out of range and speed." He paused, looking at the Betty through the hangar window. They made a choice. They decided the mission was more important than crew survival. They chose offense over defense, range over protection. And now their pilots are paying the price. The report McPherson filed traveled up the chain of command rapidly. Within weeks, copies reached every American fighter squadron in the Pacific. The document was clear: the Betty bomber was exceptionally vulnerable to fire, particularly to attacks on the wings and fuselage fuel tanks. Fighter pilots were instructed to aim for the wings rather than engines. A burning Betty might stay airborne, but it couldn't complete its mission. But the report also noted something that troubled senior officers. The Betty's existence represented a fundamental difference in military philosophy. The Americans built aircraft assuming they would be damaged, would need to bring crews home. The Japanese built aircraft assuming success or death, with no middle ground. It was a difference that reflected deeper cultural values about sacrifice, duty, and the value of individual lives. As the war progressed, this difference would only become more apparent. The same philosophy that created the vulnerable Betty would eventually spawn the kamikaze, pilots who chose to crash their aircraft deliberately rather than face the slow death of burning alive in a flaming bomber. Chapter 4: The Human Cost. Rabaul, New Britain, November 1943. 23-year-old Flight Petty Officer Takeshi Yamamoto performed his pre-flight inspection of Betty number 582, the aircraft he'd been assigned for the day's mission. His hands moved automatically through the checklist, but his mind was elsewhere, specifically on the letter he'd written the previous night and left in his footlocker. To my beloved mother and father, it began. Yamamoto, like many Betty crewmen, kept such letters updated regularly. The odds of survival for Betty crews had become mathematically grim. Of the 30 pilots who had been in his training class 2 years ago, only 7 were still alive. "Mount up," called the mission commander. Yamamoto climbed through the Betty's side hatch and made his way to the pilot's seat. His co-pilot, 19-year-old Ensign Hiroki Tanaka, was already running through the startup checklist. This was Tanaka's 3rd mission. Most new pilots didn't survive their 5th. The mission briefing had been clear: strike the American Carrier Task Force reported 400 miles southeast of Rabaul. Intelligence estimated strong fighter cover. Expect heavy resistance, the commander had said, which was military euphemism for "most of you won't be coming back." Yamamoto knew the Betty's vulnerabilities intimately. Every pilot did. During training, instructors had been brutally honest: you are flying a weapon, not a defensive aircraft. Your job is to reach the target and deliver your ordnance. Everything else is secondary. If you are hit, complete the mission before you die. 27 Bettys took off that morning, forming up into 3 formations of 9 aircraft each. Yamamoto's bomber was in the 2nd formation, middle position. As they climbed to cruising altitude, he could see the other Bettys spread across the sky, sunlight glinting off their aluminum skin. They looked graceful, almost peaceful. 2 hours into the flight, the radio crackled: "Fighters. American fighters at 10 o'clock high." Yamamoto's heart rate accelerated, but his hands remained steady on the controls. He'd been through this before. The key was to maintain formation, keep the defensive gunners' fields of fire overlapping, and trust that you'd make it through. Or you wouldn't. There wasn't much middle ground. The American F-6F Hellcats came down like hungry wolves. Yamamoto saw tracers arcing through the formation ahead of him. Then he saw it, the thing every Betty pilot dreaded. The lead aircraft in the formation ahead suddenly bloomed with orange flame along its port wing. Within seconds, the entire wing was burning, fire streaming back along the fuselage. But the Betty kept flying. Yamamoto could see the silhouette of the pilot still at the controls, trying to maintain formation even as his aircraft became an inferno. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. The pilot had to be dead or dying, overcome by heat and smoke, yet some final burst of discipline or muscle memory kept his hands on the controls. At 23 seconds, the burning Betty finally rolled inverted and plunged toward the ocean below. Yamamoto forced himself to look away, to focus on his own instruments, his own survival. But the image was seared into his mind. Then his own aircraft shuddered as cannon shells tore through the fuselage behind him. The tail gunner's position went silent. He didn't need to look back to know what that meant. More hits stitched along the starboard wing. Yamamoto held his breath, waiting for the flash of ignition that would turn his bomber into a flying funeral pyre. It didn't come. Not this time. The Hellcats were breaking off, probably low on ammunition. Yamamoto's Betty had been hit at least 20 times but had somehow avoided any fuel system damage. He'd been lucky. Impossibly, incredibly lucky. The formation, or what remained of it, continued toward the target. Of the 27 Bettys that had taken off, 19 were still flying. They found the American Carrier Task Force exactly where intelligence had reported. The carriers were turning into the wind, launching more fighters. The sky was beginning to fill with anti-aircraft fire. "Bomb run," Yamamoto called over the intercom. "Bombardier, target the carrier on the left. Everyone else, prepare for heavy flak." They went in straight and level, exactly as trained. The American anti-aircraft fire was intense. Black puffs of flak filled the sky, each one capable of shredding their thin aluminum skin. A Betty to Yamamoto's right took a direct hit to the cockpit. the aircraft simply disintegrated in a ball of fire and debris. Yamamoto's bombardier called bombs away. The Betty lifted as 1,800 pounds of ordnance fell free. Yamamoto immediately threw the aircraft into a steep diving turn, desperate to escape the killing zone. Behind him, he heard the dorsal gunner calling out damage reports. Fire in the starboard engine. Fire in the starboard engine. Yamamoto's blood turned to ice. He looked out his right window and saw flames streaming from the engine cowling. But it was a fuel fire, not a tank fire, critically different. He pulled the engine fire suppression handle, shutting down the starboard engine and flooding it with CO2. The flames died. Flying on one engine, Yamamoto nursed his damaged Betty back toward Rabaul. The return flight took 4 hours, 4 hours of constant vigilance, watching gauges, listening for any sound that might indicate spreading fire, ready at any moment to order his crew to bail out if flames erupted. They made it back. Of 27 Bettys that had departed, 11 returned. 16 aircraft and 96 men had been lost. The American carriers reported minor damage to one destroyer, no carriers hit. That night, Yamamoto updated his letter home. He'd survived another mission, but the mathematics were inexorable. Each mission reduced the odds of surviving the next. The Betty bomber was incredibly effective at reaching distant targets. It was also incredibly effective at killing its own crews. In the barracks, the replacement pilots were arriving, young men, some looking barely old enough to shave, who would climb into the same vulnerable aircraft and fly the same deadly missions. Yamamoto wondered how many of them would live long enough to write letters home, to understand the true nature of the weapon they'd been given. The Betty had been designed to project Japanese power across the vast Pacific, to strike enemies thousands of miles from home. In that mission, it had succeeded brilliantly. But the cost was measured in thousands of young men who climbed into their thin-skinned bombers knowing that every flight might be their last, that a single lucky shot from an enemy fighter would transform their aircraft into a flying furnace from which there was no escape. Chapter 5, Evolution and Desperation. Tokyo, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Headquarters, March 1944. Chief Engineer Kiro Hanjo sat in a conference room filled with naval officers, all of them grim-faced. The numbers on the projection screen told a devastating story. Betty bomber losses had exceeded 60% over the past 6 months. Entire bomber groups were being wiped out in single missions. "We need solutions," Engineer Hanjo said Admiral Yamada coldly. The Betty was supposed to give us superiority in long-range striking power. Instead, it's become a death sentence for our most experienced crews. Hanjo had been dreading this meeting. He'd known since 1939 that the Betty's design was a compromise that favored range over survivability. Back then, in the heady days before the war, it had seemed like an acceptable trade-off. Now, with hundreds of dead crewmen and shattered aircraft, that decision haunted him. "Admiral, with respect, the solutions are limited," Hanjo replied carefully. "To significantly improve crew survivability, we would need to add armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. That's approximately 1,800 pounds of additional weight, which would reduce range by nearly 40% and decrease speed by 25 miles per hour. "Then do it," snapped the Admiral. "A bomber that reaches the target but whose crew doesn't survive to report results is useless." But Hanjo shook his head. "Admiral, we've run the calculations. A Betty with full armor protection would have a combat radius of barely 1,000 miles. That makes it inferior to our older G4M models. We'd essentially be going backward. And retooling the production lines would take 8 to 10 months, time we don't have." What Hanjo couldn't say in this room full of officers, was that the problem went deeper than engineering. The Betty embodied a fundamental philosophy of Japanese aircraft design: offense over defense, performance over protection. Changing the Betty would mean admitting that philosophy was wrong, and that admission would ripple through the entire Japanese aviation industry. Instead, Mitsubishi engineers had been working on incremental improvements. The G4M2 variant, now in production, incorporated some modifications: slightly thicker skin in critical areas, rubber coating on some fuel tank surfaces, improved fire suppression systems. These changes added about 400 pounds but reduced fire vulnerability by perhaps 20%. It wasn't enough. Everyone in the room knew it wasn't enough. "What about crew protection equipment?" asked Captain Saito. "Better firefighting gear, protective clothing?" Hanjo pulled out another set of drawings. "We've developed an asbestos-lined flight suit that provides some protection against heat. The problem is that in the temperatures generated by burning aviation fuel, we're talking about 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, even the best protective gear only buys you an extra 20 or 30 seconds. And the weight of the suits reduces crew efficiency." The meeting dragged on for 3 hours, cycling through various proposals, each one ultimately inadequate. Add small armor plates around crew positions, not enough protection, too much weight. Install additional fire suppression systems, helpful but didn't address the core vulnerability. Reduce fuel load, defeats the entire purpose of the aircraft. Finally, Admiral Yamada stood up. "Continue production of the G4M2 variant with the improvements you've described. Begin design work on a replacement, the G8M, with proper protection built in from the start. But understand this, Engineer Hanjo, we need bombers now. Whatever aircraft you give us, our pilots will fly them. Make them the best you can." After the meeting, Hanjo stood alone in his office, looking at technical drawings of the G8M, the bomber that would replace the Betty. It was a beautiful design, incorporating everything they'd learned: armored crew positions, fully self-sealing tanks, redundant systems. It would be a world-class bomber. It was also a year away from prototype stage, maybe 2 years from production. By then, the war might well be over. And in the meantime, young men would continue climbing into Betty bombers, knowing they were flying death traps. Out in the field, Betty crews were adapting in their own ways. Some pilots developed tactics to minimize vulnerability, flying at lower altitudes where the thinner air reduced fire intensity, making shallower bomb runs to spend less time in the target zone, even deliberately rupturing fuel tanks and dumping fuel before entering combat to reduce fire risk, which also reduced range and mission capability. The most desperate adaptation emerged in late 1944, using Betty bombers as kamikaze aircraft. If the plane was going to burn anyway, if the crew was likely to die regardless, why not guarantee at least some damage to the enemy? Bettys were modified to carry massive single bombs, up to 1,800 pounds, and flown directly into American ships. It was a horrific calculus, but from a purely military perspective, it made sense. A Betty conducting a normal bombing mission had perhaps a 10% chance of scoring a hit and a 40% chance of being shot down. A Betty used as a kamikaze had nearly a 50% chance of causing significant damage, with 100% crew loss. The mathematics favored suicide. U.S. Navy combat reports from late 1944 and 1945 frequently note kamikaze attacks by Betty bombers. Many of these aircraft were already burning when they struck their targets, set ablaze by defensive fire but continuing their suicide dive anyway. In a grim way, the Betty's tendency to burn without immediately crashing had become an asset in this role. A Betty could absorb tremendous damage, catch fire, and still have 30 to 60 seconds of controlled flight, plenty of time to complete a kamikaze attack. Engineer Hanjo learned about these kamikaze missions through official reports. Each one felt like a personal failure. He designed an aircraft to project power, to give Japan a strategic advantage. Instead, he'd created something that killed its own crews so efficiently that using them for suicide attacks became tactically preferable to conventional missions. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, approximately 2,400 Betty bombers had been produced. Estimates of crew losses vary, but conservative figures suggest that over 8,000 Japanese airmen died in Betty-related operations, not all from fire, but a substantial majority from the aircraft's vulnerability to burning. The G8M bomber that was supposed to replace the Betty never entered production. 2 prototypes were completed but never saw combat. After the war, American engineers examined these prototypes and found them to be excellent designs, well protected, with self-sealing tanks and adequate armor. One engineer noted in his report, had the Japanese produced this aircraft in 1941 instead of the G4M, the air war in the Pacific would have been considerably more difficult. But they hadn't. They'd produced the Betty, and thousands had died because of it. In the post-war analysis, the Betty bomber became a case study in military engineering, a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing mission performance over crew survivability, of allowing doctrine to override engineering common sense. Chapter 6, Legacy and Lessons. Washington, D.C., Pentagon, November 1945. The war was over, and the process of learning from it had begun in earnest. In a classified conference room, senior officers from the U.S. Army, Air Forces and Navy were reviewing captured Japanese documents and interviewing Japanese engineers and pilots. The subject, the Betty bomber and the design philosophy that created it. Colonel Robert Stromberg, who had commanded bomber groups in the Pacific, stood before a technical drawing of the Betty. "Gentlemen, we need to understand that the G4M wasn't a failure of engineering. It was a success at exactly what it was designed to do. The Japanese Navy wanted a bomber with extreme range and speed, accepting vulnerability as the cost. They got exactly what they asked for." He clicked to the next slide, showing loss rates. The Betty's combat loss rate was approximately 55% higher than comparable American bombers. But, and this is important, its mission completion rate was actually quite good. Early in the war, Betty formations regularly struck targets 1,500 to 2,000 miles from base. No American bomber could do that in 1941 to 42. A Navy captain raised his hand. "So what's the lesson? That they made the right choice?" "No," Stromberg replied firmly. "The lesson is about balance and values. The Japanese accepted crew casualties that we would consider catastrophic. Their design philosophy treated pilots and crew as expendable resources in service of the mission. We design aircraft to bring people home. That's not just humanitarian, it's practical. Experienced crews are invaluable assets." The discussion turned to the technical details. American engineers had been fascinated by the Betty's fuel system, not because it was good, but because it represented such an extreme design choice. By completely eliminating armor and self-sealing tanks, Japanese engineers had reduced weight by nearly a ton. That weight saving translated directly into range and speed. "Could we adopt similar approaches?" asked the young engineer from Boeing. "We already did, in some ways," replied Charles Morrison, a senior engineer from the Bureau of Aeronautics. The B-29 Superfortress pushed weight limits hard to achieve range and payload. But we never eliminated crew protection entirely. Even at maximum weight, we kept armor and self-sealing tanks. Yes, it cost us range. But it also meant our crews survived to fly again. The deeper lesson from the Betty involved institutional culture and feedback mechanisms. In the American military, pilots and crews regularly provided feedback on aircraft design. Problems were reported, fixes were implemented. The system, while imperfect, allowed for continuous improvement based on combat experience. The Japanese system had been much more rigid. Once an aircraft entered production, changing it was seen as admitting error, which was culturally difficult. Junior officers who complained about equipment could be accused of cowardice or disloyalty. This meant that obvious design flaws, like the Betty's fire vulnerability, persisted throughout the war despite clear evidence of their lethal consequences. Interviews with captured Japanese pilots reinforced this picture. Flight Petty Officer Takeshi Yamamoto, now a prisoner of war, spoke candidly about his experiences flying the Betty. "We knew it would burn. Everyone knew. But we also knew that complaining would accomplish nothing. The aircraft existed, missions needed to be flown, and Japanese pilots do their duty. That is all." When asked if he'd wished for better protection, Yamamoto's response was telling, "Of course. But wishing changes nothing. We flew what we were given. Some of us died, some survived. That is war." The fatalism in his voice spoke volumes about the cultural context in which the Betty operated. The American military incorporated lessons from the Betty into post-war aircraft design doctrine. A 1946 Army Air Force's technical bulletin explicitly referenced the G4M as an example of performance optimization taken to unacceptable extremes. The bulletin established minimum survivability standards for future bomber designs, mandating self-sealing fuel tanks, crew armor, and redundant systems even when such features reduced performance. But perhaps the most important legacy was philosophical. The Betty bomber forced American military planners to confront questions about the value of human life in warfare. How much risk was acceptable? When did pursuit of mission objectives become a death sentence for crews? Where was the line between necessary sacrifice and criminal negligence? These weren't abstract questions. The U.S. had its own aircraft with design compromises. The B-26 Marauder earned the nickname Widowmaker due to early handling problems, and the B-24 Liberator was known for being difficult to escape from if hit. But American designers consistently chose crew survival over marginal performance gains. The Betty represented the opposite philosophy, and the results spoke for themselves. In the decades after the war, the Betty bomber became a staple of military history courses, particularly in discussions of aircraft design philosophy. Engineering students at MIT, Caltech, and other institutions studied the G4M as a case study in risk assessment and trade-offs. The question posed to students was always the same: given the constraints and objectives, would you have designed the Betty differently? The honest answer, many concluded, was complicated. In 1937, with the information available and the objectives set by the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Betty design made a certain terrible logic. If your goal was maximum range and speed at any cost, if you truly viewed crew casualties as acceptable losses, then the Betty was rational. The problem wasn't the engineering, it was the underlying values that defined acceptable. Some surviving Betty bombers were preserved in museums after the war. One, recovered from the Solomon Islands in 1991, underwent extensive restoration and is now displayed at the Pacific Aviation Museum in Hawaii. Visitors can walk around it, touch its thin aluminum skin, peer into its unarmored cockpit. Placards explain the aircraft's capabilities and its vulnerabilities. But no placard can truly convey what it meant to fly this aircraft in combat. No museum display can recreate the terror of seeing flames erupt along your wing, of knowing you have perhaps 30 seconds before heat and smoke overcome you, of choosing between bailing out over enemy territory or staying with your burning aircraft to complete the mission. The Betty's veterans, those few who survived the war, carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Takeshi Yamamoto, who survived 53 missions in Betty bombers before being shot down and captured, lived until 1998. In his final interview, given to a Japanese historian, he was asked about his experiences flying the most vulnerable bomber of World War II. "Every time I climbed into that aircraft, I said goodbye," Yamamoto recalled. "Not out loud, but in my heart. Goodbye to my family, my home, my life. Then I would close the hatch and focus on the mission. Because if you thought too much about the danger, about how easily the aircraft could burn, you would be paralyzed by fear. So we didn't think. We just flew." He paused, and the historian noted that his hands were trembling slightly. "After the war, I learned that American pilots called it the Flying Lighter. They thought it was a joke, a nickname. But they didn't understand. For us, it wasn't a joke. It was our reality. We flew lighters because that's what we were given. And we did our duty until we couldn't anymore." The technical legacy of the Betty influenced post-war aviation in unexpected ways. The aircraft's excellent aerodynamics and engine installation were studied and influenced several civilian aircraft designs in the 1950s. Ironically, stripped of its military context and weapons, the Betty's basic airframe design was quite good, efficient, spacious, and well-proportioned. But the cautionary lessons resonated more strongly. When modern aircraft are designed, from military fighters to civilian airliners, survivability is never an afterthought. Fuel tanks are carefully protected, multiple redundant systems are standard, and crew safety is paramount. Part of this evolution stems directly from the Betty's example of what happens when survivability is sacrificed completely to other goals. In 2019, researchers at the Smithsonian Institution published a comprehensive study of World War II bomber loss rates and their causes. The Betty bomber featured prominently. The study concluded that approximately 63% of Betty losses were directly attributable to fire following combat damage, far higher than any other major bomber type in the war. American bombers like the B-17 had fire-related loss rates around 18%, and British bombers around 22%. The study's author, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, noted in her conclusion, the Mitsubishi G4M represents an extreme data point in aircraft design philosophy. It demonstrates that technical capability without adequate survivability creates a weapon that consumes its own operators at an unsustainable rate. Modern aviation, both military and civilian, has internalized this lesson. We no longer build flying lighters, because we've learned, partly through the Betty's example, that the human cost is simply too high. Today, aviation safety protocols, design standards, and engineering ethics all carry echoes of the lessons learned from the Betty bomber. When engineers argue for additional safety margins, when designers insist on redundant systems despite weight penalties, when military planners demand crew protection even at the cost of performance, they're applying lessons written in the blood of thousands of young men who flew in aircraft that burned too easily and offered no escape. The Betty bomber's true legacy isn't its tactical achievements or its impressive range. It's the stark reminder that in the calculus of war and engineering, human lives must never become mere variables to be optimized away. The men who flew the Betty understood this truth better than anyone. They climbed into their vulnerable aircraft mission after mission, not because the design was good, but because duty demanded it and their culture provided no alternative. Their sacrifice wasn't in vain if we remember the lesson, that honoring those who serve means giving them equipment worthy of their courage, that pushing the boundaries of performance must never come at the cost of basic survivability, and that the value of a human life should never be reduced to a line item in a weight and balance calculation. The Betty bomber flew, burned, and fell across the Pacific for 4 brutal years. It accomplished its missions even as it consumed its crews. And in doing so, it taught the world's engineers and military planners a lesson that reverberates to this day, that the most dangerous enemy of any air force isn't the opposition's fighters or anti-aircraft guns, it's the willingness to accept the unacceptable in pursuit of marginal advantage. Conclusion. The story of the Betty bomber is more than just a tale of World War II aviation, it's a profound lesson about the choices we make in design, the values we prioritize, and the human cost of those decisions. From the American pilots who first encountered these burning aircraft over Guadalcanal to the Japanese crews who flew them knowing they were death traps, the Betty's story is written in courage, sacrifice, and a terrible kind of honor. The engineers who examined the captured Betty in 1943 understood immediately what many had died to reveal, that in the race for range and speed, Japanese designers had created a weapon that was as dangerous to its crews as to the enemy. The thin skin, unprotected fuel tanks, and complete absence of armor weren't oversights, they were deliberate choices made in pursuit of performance. Today, every aircraft that flies carries a piece of the Betty's legacy. The mandatory self-sealing fuel tanks, the redundant systems, the armor protection for crews, these aren't just features. They're memorials to the thousands who died in aircraft that could have been safer, should have been safer, but weren't because mission performance was valued above human life. The next time you see a modern military aircraft or board a commercial airliner, remember the Betty bomber. Remember the Japanese crews who flew missions in aircraft they knew were vulnerable. Remember the American pilots who watched enemy bombers burn and couldn't understand why they kept flying. And remember the lesson that their sacrifice taught us, that true engineering excellence isn't just about pushing performance boundaries, it's about bringing people home. If you found this story fascinating, please like, subscribe, and share. History's lessons are too important to forget. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the Betty bomber and the choices made in its design. What would you have done differently? Let's discuss in the comments below.